Hello everybody, welcome to my first video. Let's get this position back. I thought about recording a video for chess videos for a long time, since I think it has quite a few advantages. Namely, it gives me an option to think about my own game and reflect upon it and find possible improvements. Secondly, you guys could comment on it and maybe give some ideas as well, things that I've missed, or some evaluations which you think are incorrect. And thirdly, it might be entertaining for a few of you, or maybe a few of you could even learn something from it. But let's first say something about myself. I am rated 1965. My opponent in this game was rated 1930, so ratings were about the same. And this game was played in a team game. It was not really a game with much pressure on it, since our team had, after 6 rounds, 6 match points and their team had 5. So we were not in the running for the top spots, and neither were we in danger of relegation, so we could play our games quite freely and know that the result wouldn't be that much of an influence. But still, a win is always nice, of course. So in this game I played e4, I was white, and I played e4 like always, and we got a Sicilian game. And after these first moves, my opponent played a6. That was already the end of my theory, but I decided in this position to play just the principled move, which is c4, to get space. And after my opponent replied knight f6, I had to think for a while, since I thought after knight c3 the answer my opponent would most likely play would be bishop b4. And then I spent some time evaluating the consequences of this move. Theory recommends bishop to d3, but I was intending to play this, and I think after bishop takes and b takes, that the bishop pair in combination with the open files and my slight lead in development give me some compensation for the isolated double pawns, so it's playable, I think. But my opponent did not go for bishop b4. Instead he played d6. Okay, like I said, I was out of book at this point, so I just continued to develop normally with bishop e2. And now my opponent played a strange move. He played g6. And this struck me as quite a bit odd, and possibly even an error, since I thought my next few moves would give me quite a nice advantage. And the idea of g6, of course, to play bishop g7, but I thought after my move knight c2, bishop g7, and then bishop f4, I am attacking the d6 pawn twice, and black has no way to protect it except for the ridiculous looking move bishop f8, so he's more or less forced to play e5. And I thought this position would be really nice for white, because it's not clear what the black bishop is doing on g7, and also I have a nice square on d5 for my pieces. So I thought this would give me two nice statical advantages to play with. So at this point I was quite happy. And now I had to think for a bit, because I have two moves here, bishop g5 and bishop e3, and both look tempting and look to have some quite positive sides to them. Bishop g5 on the one hand fights for the d5 square, and after an exchange in the future for the knight on f6, it will strengthen my control over the d5 square. However, it will leave me without a black bishop, and in the future black might be able to get in bishop h6, and you know, that bishop could become active on that diagonal. So I preferred the move bishop e3, preventing the black bishop going to h6, and after I will play queen d2 in the future. And basically I will play against the weakness of the black bishop on g7, so I preferred to keep my bishop. And I think both options are interesting and both of them give white a nice advantage, but in the end I chose bishop e3. Okay, black continued to develop as well, knight c6. And here I was intending to castle short, play queen d2, rook a to c1, rook f to d1, and then play the position from there, depending on what my opponent would choose. But I thought, since I am intending those moves anyway, I might as well first play queen d2, with the idea that my opponent, after his most logical move, castling short, would at least have to think a bit about what if white continues with castling long, playing h4, bishop h6, h5, and continue the game in a more or less Sicilian dragon attack style of way. I was not really intending to go for that, but I thought it wouldn't hurt to give black something to think about. And black castled short anyways. Okay, like I said, I wasn't really intending to go for this plan with castling long and h4, h5. And basically I wanted to castle short and continue my play. But at this point I start thinking, what about rook d1? If I play rook d1, I am attacking his d6 pawn. He cannot protect it with knight e8, since then I would have the move c5, since now his d6 pawn is pinned, since the knight on e8 interferes with the protection of the queen from the rook. So rook d1 seems a nice move to attack d6, and he has no way to defend it, so he has to counterattack something. So then I start looking, rook d1, what about queen a5? After queen a5 I cannot take on d6 because my c3 knight is pinned, so after rook d1, queen a5, queen takes d6, he has to move knight e4, which would be quite bad. So let's see that. Rook d1, queen a5, and now queen takes d6 would be bad because of knight takes e4. But what I had missed in this position is that I in fact do have a good move here, which is the move b4. And I spent a few seconds looking at this, but after the move knight takes b4 I did not see anything convincing for white, but in fact there is. I was looking at moves like knight d5 here, but I totally overlooked the move knight takes b4, queen takes b4, rook b1. Now the queen has two squares, a3 and a5, but it doesn't really matter where he goes. If he goes to a3 I will play rook b3, and then he has to go to a5 anyway. And then we have to move bishop b6. And now the queen is trapped, and he can prolong it a few moves with queen a3 and rook b3. But black just loses his queen in this spot. So I totally missed that. But then I had some other ideas. So I had rejected rook d1 at this point, incorrectly as it turned out. But I started looking at castling long. with the idea after castling long, queen a5 no longer pins my knight, so I can take on d6 without black being able to recapture on e4. And once again the defense after castling long of the pawn on d6 by knight e8 loses to the move c5. So this looked quite attractive to me, so I played castling long. And now I thought I was threatening the pawn on d6, but in fact this is not so clear at all, because the strongest move here, which is not what my opponent played, but it would have been to play bishop e6. And now if I take on d6, he has to move knight d4 with huge complications. It turns out that white is still slightly better, but I will admit that this is way beyond what I am able to calculate. And it was only that after the game, that when I looked at this with Fritz, that Fritz showed me the following variation. Queen takes e5. Well, you are going to allow a discovery here, so I'm not sure I would have played that. Maybe I would just have chickened out with queen takes d8, but anyway, Fritz says here after knight g4 white can play queen g3, and after knight takes e2 check we recapture on e2, and after queen a5 threatening to take on a2 we just exchange immediately what now is a strong bishop on g7 by playing bishop d4. If black then takes on a2, we exchange not immediately on g7, but first we protect the c4 pawn by moving our knight to a3, and after black goes for the attack with b5, it calmly exchanges the bishops and plays king c2, threatening to trap the queen with rook a1. Okay, so black takes on c4, creating a square for the queen on b3, and white takes the b3 square away again, threatening rook a1 once again. Now black has to move c3, and Fritz just calmly suggests queen takes c3. It threatens knight takes e6 with a double check, so black is forced to play f6, and now white is just in time to exchange queens, because rook a1 traps the queen, but rook to c8 also pins and wins my queen. But after these queens get exchanged and the rooks get exchanged, we drive the knight away to e5, we can chase the bishop a bit, and after rook b1 we miraculously still have our extra pawn, have exchanged the queens, and this results in a winning endgame. But like I said, this is a computer line which any human, certainly at our level, is totally incapable of calculating. So I probably would not have gone for that. But this all happened after my opponent would have replied bishop e6, which is not the move he chose. I should say. But instead he played knight g4. Okay, now it turns out I could take on d6 after all, but I did not really like it, because after I would take on d6 he would exchange his knight for my bishop. I could exchange a few more pieces and also get the black knight to d8, where it's not that active, and only now recapture on e3. But I thought, well, I have an extra pawn, yes, this is nice, but his bishop can now go to h6. It will exchange itself for my knight on e3, and I will have doubled pawns on the e-file. And how much is my extra pawn really worth in this position? I wasn't too sure. But it turns out after bishop h6 I can play knight take to d5, bishop e6, rook d1, and now if bishop takes d5, c takes d5, bishop takes e3, f takes e3. Yes, my pawns are doubled, but I do have a really strong passer on d5, so this position would still be really good for white. However, I was not able to really evaluate this position correctly and see that many moves ahead, and I thought, well, let's just keep it simple and after knight g4 not take on d6, but exchange on g4 first, then play f3, solidify my position, and after bishop e6 I once again queen takes d6 no longer wins a pawn, of course, because he could then exchange queens and take the pawn on c4, since now my defender, the bishop on e2, has been exchanged. But I thought I could just continue here with knight d5. And in this position I think white is still quite a bit better, because I have more space. The bishop on g7 is still a bad piece, and the only thing I didn't regret about my position is that I have castled long. I would have really preferred to have castled short and have my rooks on c1 and d1, so that black could not get counterplay against my king so easily. And here my opponent, I think, made a bad practical decision. I think his best move would have been to play b5 and start play against my king, and I would have replied knight b6, after which the position is quite double-edged. I think I am slightly better, but material is even, and you know, there is still a game to be played. But this was not what my opponent chose. He went for bishop takes d5 instead. And I retook with the c-pawn, with the idea I have much more space on the queen side. My bishop has a nice diagonal where it's looking on, and I might even enforce that diagonal by playing queen f2. I will put my rook on c1, and I think I have a really pleasant position. And here I thought the strongest move for my opponent would be to go knight b8 to get the knight back into play again via the square d7. However, my opponent once again surprised me by playing a move which I think more or less loses the game. He played here knight to a5. And, well, it of course threatens knight c4, but that is easily dealt with by playing b3. And now his knight on a5 is looking rather silly. He already had a bad piece at g7. And it's still not clear how the bishop on g7 is coming into play. But now also his knight on a5 is totally out of play. So I think the position is actually close to lost here already for black. Well, black played rook to c8, and here for a moment I considered playing queen f2 with the idea of threatening to win a piece immediately with bishop b6. But luckily I just saw that this wouldn't work, because after queen f2 my opponent still has queen c7, and now after bishop b6 he has to move queen c3. And for a few seconds I thought here, hey, what about if I play queen d2 here? I am threatening to exchange his queen, and after I exchange the queens I will win the knight on a5. However, Unfortunately, I also saw queen d2 has a slight tactical problem with it, and I hope you guys see what's wrong. So after queen d2, what will black play? And you guessed right if you saw queen a1 checkmate, because the knight is pinned on c2. Ouch. That would have been a terrible way to play, of course. So I thought, well, in that case, let's get my king out of the pin and also vacate the c1 square for a rook, so that maybe now I am threatening to play queen f2. Black played f5, and I continued with my plan of rook c1. And now I think black missed his last chance for counterplay. He definitely should have taken on e4. And after I take back, I think white is still quite a bit better in this position, probably still winning. But at least now I would have to think about what if black somehow gets in a move like rook f4. I would take, and then he could maybe get queen f6 in and threaten something along the diagonal. And now if my queen leaves the second rank and stuff gets traded off, maybe he has rook f2. I mean, it's probably never going to work, but it at least would have made me think a little bit about it. But the move he chose instead was to move f4, after which I can calmly play bishop f2, and I don't have to worry about anything on the king side at all, and I can just freely continue with my plan on the queen side, which is to trade off all the heavy pieces on the c-file and then play bishop b6 and win the knight. Just as simple as that, and it's surprising, black has really no way to combat his plan. So he could try to get his knight out of a5 by moving the b-pawn, but then I will play my knight to b4 and attack both his a6 pawn and threatening to get to the juicy c6 square. So basically I think black is actually lost already, and well, as we will see in the game, he didn't have much resistance he could put up anymore indeed. So he played rook f7. I continued with knight b4 with both the idea of starting the exchanges on the c-file and already eyeing the a6 pawn in case black wanted to move his b-pawn to give his knight some squares. So black continued with rook fc7, and like I said, my idea was to exchange pieces. What white definitely should not play is of course bishop b6, which would be a horrible blunder because of knight takes c1 check, knight takes c1, or knight I mean rook, and another rook to c1 with check, and queen c1, and now my bishop is hanging. Oops. So bishop b6 looks to be a nice pin, but of course that is easy to see, that we first should exchange rooks. And now black cannot recapture with the rook because now bishop b6 would win material, so he's forced to take with the queen. And like I said, our plan is to exchange everything along the c-file, and because of the threat of bishop b6 he is more or less forced to do that, and there is only one way now to save the knight, and that is to move the b-pawn. But as a consequence this loses the a-pawn, and the knight has managed to get a square at b7, but with the following white move, b4, the white knight again has no squares. The only square it can go to is d8, and from there it again has only one option, which is go to f7, and besides going back it can continue its path to h8 or h6 or g5, and still the knight has no future at all. So yeah, black is actually completely helpless in this position, because this pawn move b4 not only is a tesuji on the knight, as Jessica Rai would say. It also fixes the black pawn on b5 so that my knight will go to c7 and win that pawn. So the game continued a couple of more moves. g5, tried to play it safe. h3 was probably not necessary, but better safe than sorry. And after h5 I went for the pawn, knight c7. My opponent played bishop h6. I now took. And after g4, h takes g. H takes g. I just played a4 with the simple idea of moving down the board with a5, a6 and so on. And since there is nothing black can do at this point, he resigned. So, all in all, this was quite an easy victory, I think, because basically because my opponent went wrong in the opening already, and the idea of playing against the g7 bishop turned out to be quite effective and provided White with a nice game and easy play. And yeah, it was a game I was really happy with, and moreover, since our team also won the game overall with 6.5 to 1.5, this was a nice afternoon for us. And this led me to making my first video. So guys, please feel free to comment on it, both on the chess contents of it or on the video editing part of it, because this is the first time that I do it. So if you have suggestions for improvements, then I will certainly take them into consideration. Okay, thanks for watching.